I walked into the company building with the kind of calm you learn after you've been yelled at for years. Calm that isn't peace, exactly, but control. The lobby air was too cold, conditioned so hard it made your skin feel slightly dry, like the building was trying to erase you before you even reached the desk. The carpet had that new gray look, patterned to hide scuffs. There were motivational posters on the wall that showed clean smiles and the words, "Teamwork," in bold letters. And I remember thinking how strange it was that they needed reminders of what teamwork was when they acted like people were disposable. My folder felt heavier than it should have, not because it was full of papers, 2 forms, a resume, and a few documents from the paperwork I'd been asked to bring, but because I was carrying time in there. Time and proof. The weight of every no I'd already swallowed. The weight of every time I'd told myself not to be angry, because anger didn't change what had happened. It only changed what kind of man you became. I had cleaned my jacket that morning, ironed the collar until it sat right. I wasn't wearing it for anybody's approval. I wore it because it was the one thing that still looked respectful when I went somewhere that expected you to earn respect. My medals were not loud. They were small, set against a veteran's uniform memory that had followed me home and then stayed folded away for most of my retirement years. But that day, for the interview, I'd decided to clip the ribbons to my inner pocket like a quiet note. I have history. I have served. I have survived. I stood at the reception desk and waited. A young receptionist looked up and smiled with the kind of practiced friendliness that comes from being trained to greet everyone the same way. The smile lasted maybe half a second longer than it should have. Then her eyes flicked to my jacket and the way my hands held the folder, careful rather than casual. "Yes?" she asked. It wasn't a harsh question. It was a question that implied the world had already decided what kind of appointment I was. "I'm here for the interview," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt, but I couldn't help it. It had been worn smooth by years of speaking while listening. "Marcus Holt, the 10:30. She typed for a moment and glanced at the screen like the screen might correct her. "Mr. Holt. Okay. The manager is ready to see you. You can take a seat. They'll call your name in a minute." I nodded and walked to the chairs near the window. Outside, cars moved along the street like they always did, each person inside their own schedule, their own story. A couple of employees sat in the waiting area with coffee cups and they talked softly. Not about me, not exactly. About something else, but the tone changed subtly when I walked in. People do that without meaning to. Their attention shifts from whatever they were saying to the fact that a stranger has entered their safe little bubble. I sat with my back straight. I kept my boots aligned and my folder on my lap. I noticed the scuff mark on the chair next to me, and I thought about how even the chair wanted to be repaired, but it hadn't been. I noticed the receptionist's hands, long fingers, nails trimmed neatly, and I wondered if she'd been trained to keep her posture firm, as if posture alone could make people treat each other better. Minutes passed. The waiting area clock ticked loudly enough that I could hear it under the low hum of the lights. A faint smell of lemon cleaner hung in the air. I didn't look like the brochure version of a competent worker, not because I wasn't competent, but because the years show themselves on you. My hair had gone from dark to a mix of dark and gray, and the skin around my eyes creased when I smiled, which made people assume I was tired all the time. I didn't try to correct them. I'd learned the hard way that some people don't want to be corrected. They want to feel superior without doing any work. I heard footsteps before I saw anyone. The door to the hall opened and a woman in a bright blazer stepped out with a clipboard. She was around my age, maybe late 30s, early 40s, and she didn't smile when she looked at the waiting area. She looked like she'd decided the outcome before the interview even began. "Mr. Holt?" she called. I stood. "Yes." As I walked toward her, the coffee conversation stopped abruptly. A man with a baseball cap lowered it slightly, not enough to be polite, just enough to hide his curiosity. I didn't blame him. Curiosity can be a form of appetite. The woman didn't lead me to a quiet office. She led me past a glass wall where other employees sat at desks. One desk had a small American flag clipped to the side, And it made me uneasy for a second because flags were easy. Flags were symbols. Symbols didn't have to do the hard work of respect. She stopped outside a conference room with frosted glass and tapped her clipboard against her hand. "We'll have you sit in there. The manager will join shortly." "The manager?" I asked gently. "Yes," she said, and that word carried a note that made it sound like the manager was the obstacle between me and the rest of the day. "Just in there. 5 minutes." I stepped into the conference room and sat in a chair across from a table that had the company logo engraved into it. The logo was clean and shiny, like it had never been handled by real hands. The walls had framed pictures of the company's awards, photos of ceremonies where everyone looked dressed up and happy. I wondered how many of those awards were earned by people who treated others with dignity. I waited. 5 minutes became 10. My watch was quiet on my wrist, and the second hand moved like it always had, indifferent and honest. 10 minutes is nothing if you're respected. 10 minutes is a reminder if you're not. Then the door opened and the manager walked in. His name was Ethan, young, confident, and full of the kind of certainty that comes from never having been humbled in public. He wore a tailored suit that looked expensive but not lived in. His hair was neat. His tie was perfectly straight. When he entered, he didn't just take a seat, he claimed the room with his posture. "Marcus Holt," he said like he'd tasted the name and decided it wasn't worth swallowing. "Thanks for coming in today." I nodded. "I appreciate your time." He laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because he wanted to be the one who set the emotional temperature. "Time, sure. Let's not pretend we don't have other candidates." I kept my hands on the folder. I could feel the ribbons on my jacket with my fingertips when I adjusted my grip. Not visible to him yet, not unless he looked closely. He leaned forward slightly. "So I read your resume. Well, you have a long work history on paper." "Work history," I repeated, letting the phrase settle like it deserved to be accurate. He waved a hand. "Yes, but it's all different things. Construction, logistics, some repairs. Then you retired. Now you're here for a role that requires someone who can keep up with deadlines. We move fast." I listened. I didn't interrupt. Listening had always been my discipline. It was easier to hear what people were truly saying if you didn't rush to defend yourself. He opened his folder across the table and glanced at my papers. His eyes flicked once toward my jacket, and the smallest pause happened, so small I might have imagined it, before his face shifted. I didn't move. I didn't lift my hand. I let him make whatever mistake he was going to make. "What's this?" he asked abruptly, pointing, not at my resume, but at my chest area. My body tightened before my mind did. Not fear, not even anger, just the old reflex, your system reacting before your thoughts catch up. He reached forward and tapped one ribbon with a finger. The sound was light. The act wasn't. "I mean," he said, voice rising a notch so it would carry, "you got all these medals, but you don't have the kind of experience we need. Are these ceremonial or something?" The question hung like smoke. It wasn't just disrespect. It was an assumption dressed up as curiosity. I stared at his finger on the ribbon like it might reveal the truth of his mind. I could feel the conference room air pressing against me. It smelled faintly of coffee and dry paper. "My record is in the documents," I said, keeping my voice level. "If you want to know what the medals represent, there's a history attached." He smiled as if I'd made a joke. "A history, right. Look, no offense, but in my experience—" He stopped, and then he decided to make it public. He turned his head slightly, as if the glass wall would help him. "You all got a minute?" he called out, though nobody else in the room had been invited. The frosted glass meant I couldn't see who might be listening, but I could hear movement behind it. He leaned back and addressed the people he assumed were watching. "This is Marcus. He told us he served. And look at these medals. We just got to make sure they aren't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The threat was implied in how he held the silence. I felt my jaw set. I remembered standing in lines after deployments, remembered people asking questions with a tone that wasn't about understanding, but about sorting. I remembered how that sorting made a man shrink until his spine forgot what it was like to be tall. I didn't shrink. I kept my posture steady. Ethan's tone turned conversational, as if he were doing me a favor by letting me feel embarrassed. So tell me, Marcus, where did you get these? Museums? Charity events? Weekend reenactment? My fingers tightened on the folder. I could have corrected him. I could have listed dates and commands and honors. I could have done what people expect a veteran to do when accused. Prove. But something in me refused to turn my life into a courtroom drama. I didn't bristle. I didn't explain. I didn't even look for permission. Instead, I said, I served. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. Okay, you served. Everybody serves. But this job isn't about service. It's about skills. And you can't tell me... He pushed his chair back a little and circled his finger again over the ribbon like he was tracing a flaw. Are you sure, he added, that you can handle the schedule? Our team works long hours. We need someone who can do the job without distractions. He let that word sit there. Distractions. It was meant to paint my medals as obstacles. I stared at the table's engraved logo. It looked like it belonged to a company that valued branding more than bravery. Then, without raising my voice, I said, if you want to discuss skills, we can. I took a breath. I didn't volunteer speeches. I didn't reach into emotion. I opened my folder and placed my resume down carefully, aligning it as if alignment mattered more than his disrespect. I repaired equipment under time constraints, I said. I coordinated logistics when information changed quickly. I trained others while the pressure increased. I kept records. I followed protocols. I reported accurately. If this job requires accuracy and readiness, that's what I've done. Ethan stared at the papers and scoffed softly. Sounds like you're selling a story. I looked at him steadily. I'm not selling anything. I'm applying. That calm made him uncomfortable. The young manager expected a reaction, expected anger, expected a defensive monologue that would let him feel like he was winning. He didn't know what to do with a man who wouldn't perform. He turned pages slowly, and I watched his eyes search for weakness. He found it in my resume the way some people find cracks in old walls. Not to fix anything, just to make the failure visible. You don't have recent software training, he said. Our systems are digital. Do you even know how to... I interrupted him with a sentence that wasn't about him. I can learn. He waved that away. Sure, everyone can learn, but can you learn fast enough? Can you keep up when people are watching? He leaned in again. His voice lowered, and it felt worse because it sounded more intimate. Look, I'm not trying to be mean. We just can't hire someone who's going to bring attention. The words landed hard. Attention. Like it was a disease. I thought about every veteran I'd seen after service, how people acted like there was something wrong with us for existing publicly. I thought about how many of those men and women had kept quiet anyway, because keeping quiet was easier than demanding respect. My hands were calm, but my mind was running old roads. I'd served during a time when things were simpler in appearance but harsher in reality. I'd been young when I first learned to carry responsibility like it was part of my body. Later, when the war was over, I discovered the war didn't end in the same way for everyone. Some people stopped fighting. Others had to keep fighting in different shapes. Jobs, paperwork, doors that stayed shut. I had never been a braggart. I didn't love the word hero because it sounded like something people said after you'd done the hard work, not something you earned in advance. I didn't want to be watched for my past. I only wanted a fair chance for the day in front of me. Ethan's public humiliation had already been done. The question was whether he would be forced to see the truth of his own judgment. I didn't win by snapping back. I didn't win by embarrassing him. I only held my posture and answered what was asked, without giving him the emotional show he wanted. Can I demonstrate? I asked. He blinked, surprised. Demonstrate what? Problem solving, I said. You said you need someone who can handle deadlines. Give me a real scenario from your workflow. He looked at his clipboard as if I'd asked him to conjure something from thin air. You don't have access to our internal... I don't need internal access, I said. I need the kind of failure you've been seeing. Missed deadlines, incomplete documentation, equipment delays. Give me the pattern. I'll explain the process to correct it. The air in the room felt tense now because this wasn't what he expected from me. He expected my silence to mean weakness. He expected my age to mean ignorance. He cleared his throat and sat up straighter. All right, hypothetically, let's say we have a shipment schedule that keeps slipping because of missing parts. We track it in our system. People enter notes, but it's inconsistent. So what do? I exhaled slowly. I'd done this kind of work when improvisation mattered. The details of civilian supply chains changed, but the underlying need, clarity, discipline, accountability, didn't. I leaned forward slightly. First, you stop trusting notes that aren't standardized. Second, you set the minimum information requirements. Third, you verify at checkpoints rather than waiting for the end. Fourth, you close the loop, so someone knows not just what to enter, but why it matters. Ethan's eyes narrowed. That's basic. It's basic because basics keep systems from failing, I said. The war ends, but the logistics don't disappear. Deadlines still hurt when you don't plan. He frowned. You're talking like you've lived in a warehouse. I didn't react. I only said, I have. He studied me again, then looked toward the glass wall as if searching for someone who would validate his disbelief. There was movement behind the frosted glass. Someone shifted. A chair creaked. Ethan turned back to me and tried to regain control. Okay, so you can talk. Can you also do? Because talk is cheap. I glanced at the corner of the conference room. There was a whiteboard with old markers. A pen sat uncapped. I also saw a small binder with training material on a shelf. I didn't ask permission. I reached for the marker and wrote with a steady hand, the kind of hand that had held tools and handles through vibration and fatigue. I wrote 3 headings: standardize, verify, close. I explained each one, not like a lecturer, like a man building a bridge while people stood on the other side waiting. I could feel the room resisting, but I continued anyway. I could hear Ethan's breath. I could feel his impatience trying to push back against my calm. When I finished, I capped the marker and set it down. My fingers had no tremor. Ethan sat back, then smiled sharply. Interesting, but still about the metals. We need authenticity here. We can't have people fabricating service. There it was again. The insistence on doubt, like doubt was his security blanket. My mind didn't go to anger. It went to paperwork, records, verification, proof. I understood suddenly what I needed to do. I didn't have to fight him. I had to show him the door he'd built in his own ignorance. I slid my folder across the table. If you need authenticity, check what's listed. If your HR requires confirmation, I'm willing to complete any verification you require. Ethan looked at the folder like it offended him. He didn't reach for it. HR is busy, he said. We'll decide quickly. He stood abruptly, ending the conversation without giving me a chance to ask my own questions. I'll be honest, he said. This role isn't going to work out. He didn't say it warmly. He didn't say it with regret. He said it like a sentence being passed by someone who believed he owned fairness. I stood as well, keeping my posture straight. Thank you for your time. He paused as if expecting a protest. When I didn't offer one, he seemed thrown off. His voice grew sharper. Don't take it personally. People just don't always fit. I nodded. Understood. As I reached for my folder, I noticed something in Ethan's eyes flicker toward the ribbon again. He was still not comfortable, still suspicious. It was almost like he needed my medals to be fake so he could keep believing he'd made the correct judgment. I walked out of the conference room with quiet steps. In the waiting area, employees watched me pass. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were hungry. They wanted the ending, my humiliation, my rage, my collapse. But I didn't give them that. When I reached the receptionist's desk, she looked up quickly, then lowered her eyes as if she regretted seeing me leave. Mr. Holt, she said, how did it go? Thank you, I answered, and I left it at that. There are some conversations you don't enrich with extra pain. I stepped back into the lobby and felt the building's cold air again. Outside light touched the glass doors like a promise. I didn't slam anything. I didn't make a scene. I didn't threaten. I simply walked out. On the sidewalk, my hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the emotional aftermath of being treated as if you're not worthy of existence. Then I saw Ethan through the glass door, still inside the lobby area. He was talking to someone on his phone. His shoulders looked relaxed, confident that he'd handled the situation. I stood across the street and watched for a moment longer than I needed to. I didn't watch to savor his discomfort. I watched because life has a way of delivering what people refuse to understand. I waited. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered because it's hard to ignore a call when you don't yet know what it is. "This is Karen from HR," a woman's voice said, controlled and professional. "Mr. Holt? I'm calling about your interview." "Yes," I said. "I want you to come back inside," she continued. "There's a clarification we need to make." My heart didn't race. It wasn't drama. It was simply recognition. The idea that the truth might still matter. "What clarification?" I asked. "I'll explain when you arrive," she said. "But please don't hang up. Please come back." So I did. I walked back into the lobby, and the receptionist's face changed when she saw me re-enter. The smile was different now, more careful, less certain. I followed Karen into a small office. She wasn't the person who'd escorted me earlier. Karen looked like she'd been awake for more than the hours on the clock, the kind of tired you get from watching young managers make costly mistakes. She sat with a folder in front of her. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'm sorry about what happened. Ethan made assumptions. He was—" "Please," I said, keeping my tone steady, "tell me what you need." Karen hesitated like the apology hadn't been enough time to land. Then she slid a document across the desk. It was a verification packet, official forms, dates, references. "Your medals," she said softly. "They match the documentation we found. Your record, not ceremonial, not reenactment, verified." I looked at the papers. My eyes didn't blur because I didn't let them. I'd seen enough paperwork in my life to trust ink and stamps. Karen swallowed. "We have a public affairs office that handles questions like this, and they contacted someone who had access to older archives. It took a few minutes because it took long enough for him to make a decision," I said. Karen flinched, but she didn't argue. "I need to understand," I continued, "what he told you." "He questioned authenticity," Karen admitted. "He said he didn't want to hire someone who would bring attention." I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh you swallow when you realize how many people confuse respect with attention and how quickly they judge before they verify. Karen leaned forward. "Mr. Holt, I'm recommending we bring you in again, but I need you to stay calm when you speak to him. Please. He's embarrassed, and sometimes people get defensive," I finished. "I understand." Karen exhaled with relief that I wasn't going to explode. I didn't come there to punish anyone. I wasn't looking to humiliate Ethan. I wasn't collecting revenge in the form of someone else's shame. I came because the job was something I needed, and because the truth mattered. A few minutes later, Karen escorted me back into the conference room. Ethan was inside. He stood when he saw me. His face had shifted from arrogance to guarded defensiveness. It wasn't a full transformation. He still looked like someone who wanted to control the narrative. But the confidence had slipped enough that the room felt different. Ethan cleared his throat and tried to restart the conversation without acknowledging the insult. "Mr. Holt," he said, "we have some information." I sat. Karen sat beside me, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough to ensure the conversation stayed civilized. Ethan looked at the folder Karen placed in front of him. He didn't open it immediately. He stared as if the pages might disappear. "This is your record," Karen said. Her voice was professional, but her eyes carried something firmer. "It was verified. Ethan's concerns were unfounded." Ethan's lips pressed together. "I didn't," he began. "I didn't let him defend himself. That wasn't my job." I waited. Ethan glanced at me and then at Karen. "So, are you still interested in the position?" he asked, but his tone sounded like he was asking if I wanted to forgive him. I listened to the subtext. I could have demanded an apology and a promise. I could have insisted on HR training sessions and public correction, but none of that would change what I already knew about him. What mattered now was whether the company would correct the hiring process in a way that honored competence rather than prejudice. "I'm interested," I said simply. Ethan nodded too quickly, like agreement could erase his earlier behavior. "Great, we'll move forward." Then he did something small but telling. He opened my resume and read it properly, not like a weapon but like a document. Karen watched him with a careful silence. Ethan cleared his throat. "We do require digital skills," he said, "but we can provide training. If you're willing—" "I'm willing," I said. He continued, stumbling over professionalism like it had escaped him earlier. "And regarding your experience, your logistics background, our team needs coordination." I didn't mention the humiliation. I didn't remind him that he'd mocked my medals like they were a prop. Instead, I asked, "What does success look like in the first 90 days? Ethan blinked again. The question was calm, straightforward. It wasn't an attack. It was a working man's question. He answered, and I listened. Karen looked relieved, but the room still held a tension that wouldn't disappear instantly. Ethan's embarrassment was real, but embarrassment doesn't automatically become respect. Respect is something people practice. So I practiced it too, quietly. I ended the meeting with clear next steps. I filled out a few forms. I arranged for a training schedule. I made sure the process didn't rely on whether Ethan felt better later. Outside the conference room, Karen walked with me back toward the lobby. "I want to apologize again," she said. "It's okay," I replied, "but I appreciate you verifying the record." She nodded, and I could see that she was still thinking about how easily a person's dignity had nearly been dismissed by someone too young to understand what responsibility costs. I left the building that day with a second chance in my hands. On the way to my car, I noticed the receptionist's eyes tracking me as I walked. She looked like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if it would be appropriate. I held the door for her when she reached for the handle of her keyboard stand. A small gesture, nothing heroic. She stopped and looked up. "Mr. Holt," she said quietly, I'm glad they checked." I met her eyes. People should check. That was all. In the weeks that followed, the job became real in the way only work can. Training wasn't dramatic. It was dull at first. Password systems, document templates, schedules on screens. Ethan didn't dominate the meetings anymore. I didn't seek his attention. When he spoke, I noticed his tone had changed. Not kinder, exactly, just more accurate. He didn't try to sound smart. He tried to be correct. That was the closest thing to recognition he could offer at that point. There were times when coworkers looked at me with curiosity again, but now the curiosity had a different flavor. It wasn't the hunger to mock, it was the hunger to understand. Sometimes people came by my desk and asked questions in careful ways about what I did, how I handled pressure, what I'd learned. I didn't turn my history into a performance. I answered what was useful. One afternoon, a team member named Tasha asked me, "How did you keep calm when everything went sideways?" I didn't think of it as a heroic question. It was a practical one. "I didn't keep calm because I felt calm," I said. "I kept calm because I needed other people to trust my next decision." She nodded like she understood in her bones. I worked. I scheduled. I checked. I verified. I followed procedures. And when procedure didn't work, I improved it. Not with speeches, but with results. The first time our shipping schedule stabilized, the team noticed. The first time documentation stopped being inconsistent, nobody pointed to the old veteran as a story. They pointed to the process and said the process worked. Ethan eventually sat with me one-on-one. He didn't apologize dramatically. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said, "You're good at this." I looked at him, not surprised by the sentence, but aware of how hard it was for someone like him to say it. "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you say anything at the interview? Why didn't you—" He didn't finish again. He couldn't. The answer was simple but complicated. I didn't explain my restraint. I didn't justify it. I told him the truth in the way he could accept it. I didn't need to, I said. My record is there. My work is there. He nodded, and the room went quiet with the kind of quiet that comes when someone realizes they should have been watching you all along. Months later, the company hosted an internal event. Nothing fancy. A gathering in a break room with coffee, pastries, and a banner about community. Ethan didn't announce anyone's past publicly. Instead, he made a small announcement about mentorship, about honoring those who brought experience. When he spoke, his voice was steadier now. He didn't mention my medals. He didn't parade them like trophies. But he did say a sentence that mattered. He said, "We're better because Marcus brought discipline to how we handle deadlines." Some people clapped lightly, some people didn't. But the company had shifted. Not because Ethan needed an audience, but because the outcomes forced the truth to be seen. After the event, an older man from accounting approached me. He recognized me from the earlier incident because everyone in the office had talked about it privately. He didn't ask me to relive it. Instead, he said, "I heard what happened in that interview." I nodded. He continued, "You could have made it ugly. You didn't." "I didn't," I said. "That's not my style." He exhaled, a little impressed despite himself. "Well, people notice that." That's when I understood the real revenge wasn't the verification packet. It wasn't Karen correcting Ethan. It wasn't any later apology. The revenge was that I stayed a full man when someone tried to reduce me to a doubt. I stayed quiet when silence could have turned into a weakness. I stayed purposeful when they wanted me to react like a wounded animal. And when the truth arrived, it arrived in a way that didn't require me to beg for recognition. It arrived because reality doesn't care how old you are, how loud someone else is, or how quickly they want to decide what you are. The last scene of that chapter came on a morning when I was walking into the office, a paper in my hand. I'd been assigned a task that I'd already foreseen from training, an internal audit for a recurring supply slip. It was the kind of job managers usually gave to whoever complained the least. Ethan met me at the hallway before I reached my desk. He didn't smile wide. He didn't make it dramatic. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Send the plan to me today." I nodded. "I will." Then he paused, and his voice lowered slightly. "And Marcus?" I waited. He didn't say sorry. He didn't need to. The word had been used elsewhere. It would never erase the embarrassment of that room. What he said instead was smaller, but it held weight. "I'm glad you didn't fight like I thought you would." I understood what he meant. He expected violence. He expected a blowback. He expected a veteran to be unpredictable. Instead, I'd been controlled. I'd stayed respectful. I'd let truth handle the rest. I looked at him and gave him the only answer that fit the moment. "I fight to do things right," I said. Ethan nodded slowly. Then he stepped aside so I could walk past, like he was making room not just for me, but for the dignity he'd ignored before. I went to my desk and opened my folder. I didn't brag. I didn't explain myself. I didn't have to. The record had already spoken, and now the work did too. By the end of that year, people stopped talking about whether I was authentic. They stopped bringing up the incident the way they stopped bringing up gossip when the truth has already settled. What remained was something quieter and better. Respect that grew from consistency. I kept my head down when I needed focus. I raised it when people needed direction. I helped because it was right, not because a camera might catch it. In the office, some days felt normal, but I never forgot that the first version of my day had been designed to humiliate me. I remembered the cold lobby air and the frosted glass, and Ethan's finger tapping at my ribbons like they were a prop. I remembered Karen's voice on the phone. "There's a clarification we need to make." I remembered that the door didn't open because I begged. It opened because the truth became undeniable. And that, more than applause, more than praise, was the recognition I carried when I walked out at the end of the day. Not sentimental, not theatrical, just earned. I locked my desk. I checked my paperwork. I turned off the light. Then I stepped into the evening air, letting it be ordinary, letting my life be mine again. Neutral studio background, soft lighting, photorealistic.